Hello, my name is Coveted Peacock, and welcome to my Revolution set review for Cliques of Nylin, designed by Stasis. This set has a lot to offer, especially in a format that's about to experience a notable rotation with Blood-like Rivers departing. Before we begin, I just want to inform you that this video consists of cards as they were on August 27th, 2024. The set's going to receive a few reworks before it hits players' hands this coming Sunday, and a couple have already been alluded to in discussions in the Custom Magic Discord. Once those changes are revealed, I'll be looking into making a brief follow-up discussing those changes and how they may impact my ratings. On top of that, there may be cards you think are some of the best in this set that you don't see in this review, likely because I've either written them off or otherwise just missed their utility entirely. If you think I'm wrong for that, let me know and maybe I can cover some things I missed in my addendum video. Finally, if you're interested in checking out the Revolution Custom Standard format or any of the cards seen in this video in further detail, links to the Custom Magic Discord server and Cliques of Nylin Planesculptor's set page can be found in the description below. Let's get started. The first thing we have to talk about when diving into Cliques of Nylin is the set's hallmark mechanic, Pledge. Pledging is a game action that creates one of 5 Clique enchantment tokens depending on the color or colors of the source pledging. If you already control a Clique, however, you instead activate the card's Pledge ability for free. Each color has access to 3 Cliques, with each Clique being connected to a 3-color shard combination. The 5 Cliques you can expect to see when pledging are Tyrell Bureau, which allows you to surveil 2, Hazak Arsenal, which creates a 2/2 colorless minion creature token with Decayed, Vishanki Incorporated, which creates a treasure token, Penwrath Insurgency, which gives a creature +2/+2 for the turn, and Silliman Laboratories, which taps an untapped creature and potentially puts a +1/+1 counter on it. I think Black runs away with some of the most powerful effects in this bunch. Tyrell, Hazak, and Vishanki are all powerful abilities to have on hand, especially if you can repeatedly pledge. Penwrath is also looking pretty solid for aggressive decks that want to apply early and consistent pressure. Silliman's the only one I feel is somewhat questionable, largely as there aren't many ways to pledge at instant speed, limiting you to lean on Silliman to slowly grow your own creatures, or just tap down your opponent's blockers. Vishanki's my pick for the most potent of these 5, largely thanks to the tempo that repeat treasure generation has been proven to provide in previous rotations of Revolution, as well as in official Magic, though I could see Tyrell or Hazak outshining it once decks start to coalesce. There are a handful of pledge cards that are reasonable to expect to see popping around the format here and there in the coming weeks. Pledge cards kind of divide into 3 categories: largely playable, debatably decent, and draft chaff. We're going to skip the chaff for the most part, but there are a handful of cards that teeter between the other 2 categories, and even a few that teeter out of the chaff range, so there's plenty to discuss. We'll start with the goodies, though. These first 3 don't really require a ton of discussion about other cards, so let's run through them real quick. Corrupt Congressman is probably the best source of repeatable pledging in Black, both because it can pledge on enter and attack, and it gives you a way to turn a smoothing Clique like Tyrell or Vishanki into a finisher by tormenting your opponent to death. Melon's a solid early protective piece that helps set up Penwrath or Tyrell, or picks a relevant Clique against your opponent's colors if needed. Demographer is likely the strongest option of these 3 by providing some consistent card selection on such an early turn, nonetheless. Though it's also the least consistent means of pledging, because you only get the pledge when you discard a non-land card, which can make some early turns look a little awkward. There's more to talk about with these next 5, so let's start with Grassroots Campaigners. I'm of the opinion that this may well be the most potent source of pledging this set has to offer, thanks largely to the abundance of powerful ways to squeeze in multiple landfall triggers every turn currently available. Any of our Evolving Wilds variants, such as Warpway Rings or Redeveloped Cityscape, the latter of which we'll get to at the end of this, get 2 triggers on their own, and they all play nicely with Techie Pledge, providing an extra way to return lands from graveyard for more landfall hits. It also provides some additional value on any other source of getting lands at play, such as shooting your own creature with a Blooming Cocolona, playing just simple ramp spells, and can really start to turn up the tempo fast. The big thing worth talking about here, though, is Skitter Tiller with Yen's Slope Skitter, a proven effective combination over the last few months that looks to become even more potent when every land drop after the first comes with a treasure token off of the Vishanki Clique. I think Campaigners has a ton of value to be found and is a card we'll be seeing pop up a lot over the next 2 years. Ballot Register is my candidate for the pledge effect that beats out Demographer in blue, and possibly one of the best pledge effects in the set. Tyrell and Hazak are both strong cliques to pledge to outright, and even beyond reducing the activation cost of your clique, there are some solid deck building synergies you can line up with a lot of cards from Duelists of Varrow. Rallying the Revolutionaries acts as additional consistency to your cost reduction effect. A bunch of solid Dare cards from the set benefit from the cost reduction. Most of the class enchantments appreciate speeding up their levels, and there are some other interactions, like using Mundak for 1 mana to pick up and replay the Registrar. Why spend 3 mana to pledge the Clique when you could spend 3 mana to pledge and grow your Mundak? Getting a bit more serious, I see Registrar doing the most work with Time Worn Crags and Revolutionary class. Crags' cost reduction can be favorably stacked with Registrars to get you closer to free activations, and Revolutionary class plus Registrar guarantees that you can get to level 2 on turn 3 regardless of which card was played first on turn 2. Election Fraud's a card that I'm pretty optimistic about. The ability to pledge twice and do so at instant speed promises a significant boost in value as long as it's not the first time you're pledging. Drawing a card and surveilling 2 doesn't look super remarkable, but drawing a card, surveilling 2, and then surveilling 2 again starts to make it look a lot less embarrassing. Drawing a card and tapping down 2 of your opponent's creatures is probably some of the best value you could expect to get out of the Silliman Clique as well. It's important to note that pledging puts the activated ability on the stack, so the draw will always occur before the pledge effect. This is most important with the Tyrell pledge because of that Surveil 2. I'm most excited to squeeze this in after you've pledged to Vishanki with a non-blue color, because it stores 2 mana in treasures for future turns, and with cost reduction from something like Learned Class or Keranos, can start to become mana positive, or at the very least mana neutral. I think you're happy to run this alongside Class and Keranos, even if you aren't able to pledge Vishanki beforehand, but doing so does make this interaction much more powerful. The first thing I saw anyone talking about when Cliques was announced, as fittingly the Incumbent set, was Incumbency. A simple value generating piece for control decks on the surface, draw and gain 2 for 2 mana is a fine enough rate that looks a little bit better when subsequent copies come with a Surveil 2 for your trouble. Where things start to go from promising to combo potential is when you pair the card with Get Your Wish. Incumbency sets up the 3-color permanent to ensure Get Your Wish can not only find Incumbency, but either free cast it or any other needed 1 to 3 mana spell the following turn at instant speed. Especially when paired with some of the other smoothing tools, control tools, and treasure generation, Incumbency is very likely to win the game by casting for 4 times pretty trivially. Last for the reasonably solid pledge effects, though probably the most uncertain of the bunch, is International Development. 3 mana, land taps for 2 mana auras are largely forgettable, but Pulsing Soundsea being in the format starts to make some of them look a little more interesting. I do love being able to pledge alongside making Soundsea tap for 2, since the Clique becomes a reasonable outlet for your excess mana if you run out of spells, but with only 4 copies of Soundsea lining up, this may require some additional legwork. That said, the format's about to get some more consistency with finding non-basic lands, so we'll see if this engine crops up anywhere. Bridging towards the less playable pledge effects, let's start with the cycle of common voters. These are mostly chaff, but I could see Idealistic Voter and Ardent Voter having some potential if you're that desperate for additional ways to pledge, largely thanks to the former's stat line and the latter's relevant keyword, but I also wouldn't be shocked if neither of these cards really gain any traction. The same can be said more readily for the other 3. Lofty Voter's a 2-1 flyer, Informed Voter's a 1-4 with Vigilance, and Eager Voter's a 2-3 with Lifelink. They just don't really carry enough excitement for me. Similarly uncertain are these 3 pledge effects, largely because they all feel a tad too clunky. Killing in the Name of is likely to be a blank against a number of relevant threats in the format, especially with this set entering the format with such a heavy multicolored focus, though it could still see some play. Estranged Aristocrat is a bit slow, and the pledges you can hit off of her are largely replacing the thing you sacrifice with something equally disposable. Minister of Utility has some intrigue behind it, being able to comfortably shuffle which clique you have active with Melon, but not having access to Hazak or Vishanki, which I think are the 2 best cliques, really hurts its constructed viability. Our final pledge card comes with another card worth talking about, an important observation to be made. Between Gubernatorial Fundraiser and Meeting of the Elites, Red is getting some solid consistency to jump up to 4 mana on turn 3 without the help of green. Both of these cards have their additional uses. Meeting of the Elites can be reasonably transformed into a card advantage engine. Fundraiser setting up your clique makes it a shoe-in for any red X deck looking to either pledge to Vishanki or Hazak, or just wants to improve the consistency of their Get Your Wish. But the window to jam a bunch of black and red 4-drops early is starting to really open, and I'm expecting many people to take the plunge into that territory. Moving on from Pledge to the rest of the set, let's talk Planeswalkers. Garen Returned Prophet promises a lot of value across his abilities. He can filter cards away if you need him to, he can get some reanimation value off of his second ability while also doing some sacrifice synergies, and he can provide some removal with his last ability. He's a tad fragile with how slowly he accrues loyalty, but his second ability in particular presents some very appealing avenues of play. From the odd creature that really wants to die, such as Wildfang Cavalier, to theft effects like Nyosa and No Time to Waste, there are a few obvious options, but there's additional avenue hidden on the card. Because the ability has a delayed trigger with the words when you do, the creature you sacrifice is a valid target to return. Looping the effects of creatures like Gubernatorial Fundraiser or Oldun's Rough Riders cycle promises a significant amount of value generation and is an engine I expect to see a decent amount over the coming weeks. In a perfect world, Severin Sparkmind is Revolution's equivalent to Gideon Ally of Zendikar, a powerful token generation engine that has an additional value which threatens to close out games in the form of powerful downticks. Unfortunately, this isn't a perfect world, and I'm not so optimistic that the Sparkmind has what it needs to become an all-star of the format. What Severin does offer is certainly enticing, that being said. The option to spend counters instead of loyalty helps make up for his inability to gain loyalty counters, and his second ability not only shuts down opposing blockers when needed, it can also untap any permanents you have with valuable tap abilities, from cards that generate extra mana to some valuable engines that perform better when used repeatedly. Severin's biggest weakness, though, even over his low loyalty total and his inability to gain more, is his restrictive casting cost. There are some ways to cheat colors of mana in the format, such as getting higher color counts with Get Your Wish, or using treasures to get the job done. A banned casting cost is just a little too awkward to do too much in the format without the right deck making it hum. I'm a bit split on the right home for High Senator Talpa. She's a pretty potent equalizer in the right scenarios, helping to stabilize a sketchy board state against go-wide aggro decks, or refill an empty hand against grindy high-value control opponents. I can see either scenario being enough reason to want Talpa, but I think the more tokens she makes, the fewer cards you're drawing, and vice versa. Sideboarded in for grindy control matchups against Ardor decks, or main deck a copy or two in your Advisor's deck if you're trying to keep your curve low and need some ways to refill. Scrapyard Mecca is a card. I'm not really sure I can provide a more apt summary than that. On the surface, I feel like it's capable of doing so many valuable things. A 5/5 for 3 that dodges sorcery speed removal is huge. It works phenomenally when pledging to Tyrael to Surveil, since it fills your graveyard to skip the crew cost, as well as pledging Hazak to amass minion tokens, either to swing wider or just use an idle minion to crew your mecha. The discard 2 Rider is a little tough when you haven't gone wide enough, but small swings can still be used as card filtering, and the draw being optional means you never have to take a bad exchange unless you want to. Finally, a lot of other versions of this effect look at combat damage to provide draw rather than the number of attackers you have, which gives this some more immediacy, as well as a better guarantee that you get value from your attack. With all of that upside, I should be really high on this, right? Well, for all of its boons, I can't help but worry that the mecha has a massive hidden cost. It's kind of a critical build-around card that rewards you the more your deck is slanted to play into it. But the more pointed your deck building choices become in favor of the mecha, the worse every hand that can't play it feels. I'm tempted to call Scrapyard Mecca one of the set's biggest build-around cards for that reason. When it's good, it's kind of amazing, and when it's absent, your deck probably falls on its face. But regardless of this, this is one I'm going to be experimenting with a fair bit. I've seen some buzz for EO in a known quantity deck, red-white tokens, and honestly, I get it. EO is a promising buff for your board state while shrinking any large blockers your opponent may have, and both Love of a Lifetime and Ardor Forefront of Freedom help to break parity and ensure that your tokens are outmatching any blocking creatures. The green splash can be a tad tricky, especially with mana bases getting a little slower as we say goodbye to New Divide and the Dormant Lands, but I think the upside will heavily outweigh the risk in this regard, especially when you can only run 1 or 2 copies and still reliably have access to it thanks to Love of a Lifetime. I think in this case, love always wins. I can't be too sure whether Survivors of the New World is a hot card that generates a lot of necessary value, or a trap that baits you into relying on it only to realize that, even with the value, it's a 3/1/1s for 4 mana. The most promising use case in my eyes is probably cheating into play from something like Unveil the Menagerie, but even then it's kind of awkward when your mana cheating spells hitting a 4-drop for 4 mana and probably missing out on a second creature as a result. Maybe you're flipping into Survivors and Thorngrafter, and that hurts a little less, but I don't think I'm holding my breath for this one. I am really excited for Kunai Stone. With the announcement of Nylin joining Revolution came a vote for one of the 5 faction mythics to receive a special Renegade promo to celebrate the new rotation. And with a third of the vote, the Kunai Stone was crowned as people's choice for the ultimate overlord of Nylin. I think it's a good amount of what folks were looking at, just thinking of trying to find replacements for Keening Bell Tower. But even beyond that, I'm pretty fond of the Ominous Orb. Untapping the Kunai Stone yields a lot of card flow, and it's a nice way to get Indulgence triggers that is probably a little less fragile than Mareyes. There's some potential engine value to be found here, especially with a card that I'll get to soon, but just keep an eye on the Kunai Stone for now. Everyone loves Dante. Dante's a solid curve topper, Dante's an outlet for your excess treasures, Dante even makes some treasures for you while killing your opponent and their troublesome permanents. I don't think there's a whole lot to be said about Dante. 5 mana 4/4 flyers, a solid enough stat line. There's some value to be had here. Interacting with your opponent's always a powerful thing to be doing. It's a simple Jund bomb, and sometimes simple is both good and lethal. Revolution currently has 2 different crop rotation effects in the format between Peasant Class and Grow Over, though those are both a bit slow to get that ball rolling. Nylin gives us a way to speed that engine up a bit, with Estrath and Gentrifiers providing us a repeatable crop rotation effect that also scales the threat over time, and Golden Age, which gives us one that could generate even more value in multicolor decks that can lean on graveyard value in the late game. Both of these effects also get the land untapped, meaning they're deceptively cheap for the cost, with the only glaring drawbacks really being found on Gentrifiers, as it can only sacrifice basic lands and comes with all the expected vulnerabilities of being a creature with 3 toughness. That being said, there are a few solid utility lands to grab, and mana fixing is always valuable in formats that want you to play more colors. I've got high hopes for Golden Age, and I could see Gentrifiers squeezing into greedier decks. Speaking of lands to fetch, this is probably the biggest reason in the new set to lean on your crop rotation effects. I initially wrote off Estrath as a gimmick that rewards you with Wooburg on turn 3 if you can somehow string together a 2-color permanent and an off-color pledge over the first 2 turns, but the more I'm thinking of the shape the format may take, the more I'm liking Estrath as a way to reliably produce the 3 colors most important to your deck with your on-color pledge in play, or even a means of generating additional mana if you're playing an off-color pledge, such as pledging to Vishanki for treasures while playing blue or white. In those scenarios, Estrath not only provides needed mana fixing, but also potentially helps accelerate you to the bombs you need to get in order to play sooner. Estrath also pays off your early play enchantments, such as the new Policies or Varro's class enchantments, which is a nice bonus when Peasant Class not only provides mana fixing, but also can find your Estrath. I'm a fan here. As you might expect from a 3-color set, there's a lot of cycles across the set that care about the 3 colors that each faction cares about. The agendas are one such cycle that's very reminiscent of some cycles we've seen in official Magic, but I think these have a much more meaningful cost. Having to control permanents of their respective colors limits their ability in decks that don't really care about playing into the board, but when you do play into the board, a lot can be said about these. Vishanki Agenda provides recursion, card advantage, and maybe theft, and treasure generation at the cost of it exiling once you're all said and done. Hazak Agenda can give you a pair of minion tokens, a way to spend a token for some card draw, and a chance to remove abilities from creatures to both strip away Decayed from your minions and disable troublesome abilities from your opponents. Sylvan gets a decent stat buff, its own source of card draw, and a dramatic reversal for any mana rocks or other type abilities you might have lying around. And Penwrath can make a hasty 2/2 that can't block, Trumpet Blast its own board, and remove a creature if your board's big enough. All of these seem solid enough if the enabler is there, and pledging on turn 1 or 2 is a reliable way to have these online as soon as you might have the mana to cast them. The only card that's not really noteworthy here is the only one that's not on screen. Tyrell Agenda is a pure recursion piece. It can get back an instant or sorcery, artifact or enchantment, and creature or planeswalker, and then exile itself to prevent loops. Without that clause, I think there'd be a real conversation to be had, but with it, I'm not sure the heaviest control colors really want a recursion spell that doesn't work when they're not on the board. I've put off talking about Tomer for a little bit in the review, largely because I think the agenda spells were necessary context to help evaluate him properly. I think Tomer works best when you can pledge on turn 1 or 2 and keep the clique around, since a turn 3 Tomer opens the window to immediately follow up with a free multicolored spell of the colors of your clique. And the best spells you can hope to play off of Tomer are instants, since they can be played on an opponent's turn to maximize the value of your 3-mana 2/2. If you can get there reliably, I'm super thrilled to have Tomer in my Jund lists where you can lean on Gubernatorial Fundraiser or Grassroots Campaigner to pledge Vishanki, and tee up for both a solid multicolor threat alongside him, and then hold up removal or Vishanki Agenda to benefit from the cost reduction multiple times in a turn cycle. He may not get there, but the chance that he does is enough potential for me to give Tomer the time of day. I'm not so sure where to take bulk bioengineering, but I'm pretty sure it starts with Acid Hydra. Drop is practically guaranteed to be offline unless the prior turn was spent casting bioengineering, but the upside here is that Hydra might be better with drop offline when you're spending very little mana to find an Enduring Gentile, Club Promoter, or Hardy Rough Rider and getting their enter effect while still putting the card in your hand. I think Campaigner makes a better stompy deck, though bioengineering's largely useless in multiples, and the deck can probably be really sluggish when bioengineering is not in your hand. Another card I wasn't super optimistic of on my first few passes, I do have to admit on review that Venture Capitalist shows more promise than I thought it would, especially since I think we're sitting on the perfect storm of synergies right now. Cyberos and Uldun collectively provide 3 different 0-mana artifacts, along with other powerful synergy pieces such as Plasma Armory, Skin-Shifting Steel, and Forgotten Cultivator. Couple that with the discount and quote-unquote card advantage provided by Revolutionary Supplier, and it starts to look very feasible to unload a handful of artifacts rapidly, hopefully investing the last of that mana into a Stella's Journal to refill the hand. Toss in the Burning of P-Day to have each spell grant your robot tokens +1/+1 in haste, and suddenly this is looking like it could be a real strategy here. I especially appreciate the small synergies. Skin-Shifting Steel makes future robot tokens 3/3s while it's in play. Imposing Oddity can move its living counter off to a ruin land played before the steel to animate it permanently, and having some ruins and utility lands for steel also plays nicely to discount Stella's Journal. I gotta admit, Venture Capitalist may not be super consistent, but it looks really explosive with the right hands. I really wanted to leave this card out of the review, but I kind of have to face facts with this one. Those of you watching this video cook brews beyond my comprehension. Let's get the obvious layer out of the way here. In Revolution Eternal, Gaze Upon Civilization is another enabler for Moonlight Prophet combo. And while it's the highest cost option of the mono blue ones, it's probably more viable than Battle Trance or Elseworld Oracle, thanks mostly to its approval effect. As far as how viable that approval ability is in normal Revolution, I'm kind of ashamed to admit I think this might actually have legs. I don't think it's as reliable as Tomer, but it's far less restrictive than Tomer, as it doesn't require the spell cast to be multicolor, and it cheats the full cost rather than a single mana pip per color you have in play. I'm not super confident that approval is going to be reliable to get full, but if you pledge to a non-blue clique, this can squeeze a Moresso in play the turn you play it, and gets you to full approval for future turns, and could even generate additional mana if you're using Gaze on future turns to cast the spells that Moresso cares about. I guess in Standard this can also get a Neokana headliner to your hand off the top of your deck, but I'm not sure that part's super exciting. This one's for Stasis. Just Stasis. I see you bringing up the Quindril Accords in the Revolution chat, and it is for you and only you that I'm giving this card a fair shake. Every fiber of my being says the Wooburg card is bad. Don't waste your time. But with the cheating we've covered so far between Tomer, Gaze, Estrath, and Treasure Generation, I can see Quindril Accords being somewhat consistently castable. Am I super optimistic about this? I'll give it a solid maybe. Pledging Vishanki helps get this out, and if you're running pledge cards already, then that 8-mana pledge costs pretty much just a hoax. 5/5s are a lot of pressure, especially when they come stapled card draw and a decent creature getting the effect reused. I think this card's a meme, don't get me wrong, but it's a meme with potential constructed viability, and I can't quite tell if that scares me. Just, if you're spamming pledge, maybe make sure you don't deck yourself. After this rotation, Elixir of Immortality can no longer save you. There's a handful of different ways to interact with multiple permanents at once coming in Nylin, and I think all of them are playable in some capacity. First off is the most overtly effective sweeper, Chromatic Rift. At face value, Rift is a typical 5-mana Wrath, but being able to sculpt around creatures based on how many colors they are provides some deceptive opportunities to keep your own board state running unfazed. Cybros provides a number of colorless creatures and cyborg tokens to incentivize leaving colorless creatures unscathed, an angle that can be further supported by the robot generators in Nylin like Severin and other pieces like Player Band. Or you could lean onto the set theme and go hard on multicolor creatures, while using Rift as a sideboard tool against monocolor heavy decks like Love of a Lifetime. Even if you just need it to be a full sweeper, Rift seems reasonably reliable. Coup d'etat has some interesting things going for it, thanks largely to its potential as a cheaper -3/-3 sweeper than Chronicle of Extinction in the right deck that can also kill high toughness, low power creatures that might otherwise dodge the wipe. But the fact of the matter is that Chronicle is one of the most well-established control tools in the format right now and is sticking around for a whole extra year. Barring a change to Chronicle, I think it's likely to push Coup out of most decks that would want to play it, but a sweeper that you can replay off of Prismatic Mantle or Harmony off of Golden Age isn't to be ignored. And I could see Coup finding home all its own in places where Chronicle wouldn't fit. It really helps that a base cost of 3 makes it very easy to curve a 2-mana pledge into Get Your Wish for Coup against faster matchups, improving the consistency of an otherwise sketchy casting cost. I think Work Safety Violation has a lot of promise if the mana can line up. Cliques are natively 0-mana enchantments, so at a baseline this can remove a 4-drop as well as an opponent's Clique for 2 life, or pick away a pair of 2-drops and a Clique for 3. The lower to the ground the opponent is, the more life you have to work with, the more potent Work Safety gets. So if this doesn't wind up in main decks, I could at least see it being a solid sideboard piece if you really want to mop up some tokens. Or like Love of a Lifetime plus a 1-drop. Considering our only proper non-land permanent destruction so far comes in the form of H3 Procession, which lacks the flexibility, and Shockwave Purge, which is a bit conditional, Work Safety could really squeeze into a few decks where needed. It's also in some colors that don't have access to the effect beforehand, so looking forward to seeing this one work. Perhaps the least remarkable but still high potential card of this bunch is Noxious Conditions. Unlike Coup d'etat, it has a much steeper hill to climb to justify its placement over Chronicle of Extinction, considering where they land on the curve. But the potential upside of Conditions is considerable if it can provide a steep spike in mana by clearing enough creatures. And possibly even clearing your own minion tokens if you're building up to it. But Chronicle hitting more creatures and being more flexible with late game value really does make this a hard sell. I see Conditions being a better candidate if you're either using to convert your own minion spam into mana, or if you're looking at instant speed alternatives to Drown in Sorrow or Cull Populace. Another interesting card that's reminiscent of a cannon-constructed heavy hitter like Severin is Warring Inspector. Definitely has a lot going for it on the surface. 3/2 flash flying threat is significant for helping closing out the game quickly, and the disruptive ability propels really fast by either stealing away needed interaction from the opponent's hand to disrupt them for a turn, flicker out a troublesome permanent for your opponent, or blink out a token like a Clique out of existence. I think the biggest challenge the Inspector has going for it is its kind of restrictive casting cost, limiting how consistently you could play it on curve, though slower decks can still reliably lean on it, and that artifact typing, which makes it much more fragile in the face of Thunderous Avalanche, a card which is already likely to see an uptick in play with the Clique tokens and treasures running around. I think the ceiling for Inspector's high, but I do also think the odds are kind of stacked against it right now. Scandalous Revelation's a tough one for me to evaluate, because I can't quite tell how potent this card can really be. It's an interesting marriage of Exsanguinate and Skeletal Scrying and kind of Sphinx's Revelation, and while it could be a really interesting value piece in a control deck, I'm not really sure it's necessary. Instant speed helps a bit, but having to exile cards from the graveyard is a real cost that you need to work towards. I think the biggest question here is whether this squeezes in over more stable value spells like Chronicle of Precedence or more interactive pieces like Ifara's Judgment. This may have a shot, but I'm not optimistic. Prime for Innovation is one of those, let's think about the ways we can break this cards, and I could see my mind going to some interesting avenues for spicy build-arounds. The big place my mind immediately goes to is Ego Split. Free casting an Ego Split has some huge potential value when you're copying something like Hoarding Calebra, though it's also just a lot of hoops to jump through to make an already good card overkill. There's something to be said about this card entering a format full of blessings from Theros Age of Tracks as well. Fable of Tooth and Fur seems like the best aura to cheat out with Prime this way, but I'm suspicious that that's going to be playable. If you're looking to give something funky a try, maybe brew around Prime for Innovation. I'm not sure where I land on Penwrath Dispatcher. I feel like it's frail, I feel like it's slow, and there are a lot of reasonable arguments to be made that this is worth skipping over, but chaining mana is always worth at least a cursory glance in my book. If you're able to turn Dispatchers sideways, there are a few interesting creatures that could get cheated in off of it, such as Scophos Conqueror or the new Hazak Commandos, as well as any of the few Decayed creatures we'll get to later, since Decayed triggers when the creature attacks, a process that the Dispatcher skips when putting the creature directly into play attacking. I'm not sure that's enough to make the Dispatcher work, but maybe if we ever get a way to reliably give it haste, this could start to crop up. Nylin's coming in with two big tutors that both show promise, so let's talk about them real quick. Axiomatic Shift has a lot of promise in counters-based decks that can reliably cheat that X cost down to grab the relevant creatures. If the big green Tiller deck is looking to splash to improve consistency, I could see white being a reasonable splash to get Shift into the deck. There are also some fun interactions you can do with counter spam across your creatures, specifically thinking of Invasion's End, throwing Defender counters down across your board and then picking them off with Axiomatic Shift. Cryptology, meanwhile, seems more tuned to specifically lean favorably into combo decks, but there may be some potential in control decks as well. There's the obvious use of finding additional copies of Incumbency, but Tutor's opening value of using toolbox strategies helps you justify copies of powerful cards going as a light splash. If you're on a handful of powerful 4-drops, for instance, you can lean on Cryptology to find one after you discard Surveil or have another removed. Alongside Get Your Wish, I think Grixis midrange and control shells might get pretty darn consistent at finding the pieces they need to win the game. If you want to think about more gimmicky stuff, Knurling Tive's an interesting card that may be worth grabbing off of Axiomatic Shift if you're trying to build around it. I can't think of many powerful activated abilities of creatures to grab off the top of my head, beyond like maybe Melon, which isn't super remarkable on its own. But where things get interesting is with Ziv Replisparked. Because Ziv's second ability makes it a creature, the loyalty counters on it will temporarily pass his loyalty abilities to your other creatures that have counters. Forcing your opponent to discard a card for each creature you control with a counter on it seems like a decent enough payoff if you can live the dream, though I think living the dream's a pretty important condition to note there. There are some other fun things you could do, like using Builder of Monuments to have your squad tap for free artifacts like Warpway Rings, or using Mykian to convert your counters to card draw, but I think regardless of what you're doing with the Hive, it's bound to be janky as hell. Speaking of Warpway Rings, Freightyard Scappers can be a solid, reliable means of looping rings in exchange for a treasure token with each shot, which seems like it could have some potential. Unfortunately, I think the Scrappers is mostly going to be relegated to the fringe due to how slow it feels, though I could see it slotting into heavy artifact sacrifice decks that lean on cards like Plasma Armory, or maybe you use it to cheat out an Altar of Chrome that you discarded early. I will see. I personally am enamored with Dantes Inferno. I think 4-mana deal 4 is a reasonable enough tool for removing threats or pushing damage over the top in midrange. Just look at Gleaming Laser. And the ability to cash it in later with excess treasure and artifact mana allows Inferno to be a real reliable tool to help push you across the finish line or buy time to stabilize the board. The tapped treasure's making up for the overkilling of smaller creatures or planeswalkers with low loyalty, and takes this card into staple territory, in my opinion. I think Grixis and Jund both look pretty comfortable in this new format, and I think both decks would be more than happy to run Inferno if you can. Defect is another card I wrote off initially, thinking it wouldn't really be all that worthwhile, but then I started comparing it to No Time to Waste. Defect can only take creatures, but it keeps the creature for as long as you don't attack with it, and holding onto the creature for longer means that's more time to yield value off of passive activated or triggered abilities. You can decide to cash it in and kill it off with Decayed at any time, and you can find other ways to sacrifice it as well. I don't think this is going to be as effective as No Time to Waste by any means, but I think both are solid tools to take away your opponent's toys and use them to your own ends. Census Surveyor is a strange one. My gut says this is a seed to splash blue in your white and colorless Advisors decks, but as solid as having an access to an anti-token card can be, it looks a bit awkward for an aggressive deck that loves having multiple copies of its best creatures in play, so what then? Maybe Surveyor's fate lies in the hands of Ozon's Blessing. Perhaps in a Bant or Bant plus toolbox list, leaning on Blessing and Axiomatic Shift to grab the right creature for the right occasion. I do especially love Blessing as it can help Surveyor heavily punish a player not expecting it to clear away their board, and the last clause can be quite meaningful against decks leaning on sacrifice value. Keep your eyes peeled for this one. Let's just rapid fire a few of these higher rarity +1/+1 counter synergy cards real quick. Distributive Justice has some interesting potential, but I'm not sure the hoop you jump through leads to an exciting enough payoff, and the counters provided may be just shy of enough to be excited about the front side on its own. Xeno has some interesting potential if you can distribute enough unique counters, and Genotype Splicer seems promising as a means of getting said unique counters, but both seem a tad too clunky to be truly reliable. There's also a few interesting hate pieces in the set to talk about. Disestablishmentarianism, which I propose we just call Dizzy for our own sanity, is a needed tool to preempt and combat pledge and treasure spam, though the fact it shuts off your own abilities limits its universal appeal. Scathing Remarks isn't the best way to shut off life gain in the format, but it seems valuable if you have opponents looking to monopolize game actions. Flaw in the System is also a solid avenue to punish excess greed, though like any artifact creature, it may suffer from fragility. I'll be curious to see where these pop up, though. Stompy creatures are cool. Small stompy threats that grow are extra cool, and in spite of all of that, I think Aspiring Anarchist is just a trap. With a strong enough curve, there are plenty of reasonable threats to copy the stats of, and because it scales based on your other creatures, it's not the worst top deck. I'm not sure I can bring myself to be excited about the Crocodile on a skateboard. Whoever kills me with this to teach me hubris, I get it, but I'm not sure I'll ever be eager to queue this up on my own. Even after losing haste, Ardor remains one hell of a top end for token decks, and Sparks of a Revolution and Flags on High look ready to make sure she's got enough of a supporting crew to last the time up until her inevitable rotation. We are losing Raislet Meditation with Blood Like Rivers rotating, and that does open up a slot for Flags on High, although giving a creature +1/+0 in haste isn't nearly as powerful as Lava Spike, and I could see Sparks being worthwhile in some quantity, though perhaps a 1-mana 1/1 with haste isn't enough to justify the front side. Both of these cards have some real potential, and a ready-made home ready for them, though. Lightning Warmonger is a tough one to talk about. Thanks to Silver in the Revolution chat, a combo was found pretty quickly that uses Warmonger in conjunction with Squall Runner Duo, tapping the Warmonger for 3 red mana and spending 2 to wander the Warmonger for infinite red to cast creatures. Followed up with any of a solid handful of red wander payoffs, the potential here was enough for Warmonger to openly be added to the list of cards getting adjusted. As is, I think this combo could be decently problematic for the coming format, so let's save talking about Warmonger properly for my addendum video. I want to be excited for the Venerable Veteran. I want to be really optimistic about its potential, and I see it do a ton of work in the coming format. The sad truth, however, is that this is a combo card so delicate that we may never see it live up to its potential. In Revolution proper, anyways. I imagine Veteran's going to have to force curators to think about Revolution Eternal for a long time to come, with the threat of it always lingering at the fringe, waiting to strike. For now, I'll be shocked if Veteran sees play. It's just a bit too slow to use it as repeatable sacrifice fodder when the best sacrifice effects are one-shot or otherwise don't do enough with Veteran to justify the mana investment. But if a combo ever arises, I will absolutely get my games in before it gets shot down. I haven't heard much buzz about Serve again, but I do like this with some of the sacrifice pieces we have entering the format. Any creature that you'd want to have die, you'd likely be happy to get a second copy of on their way out. It's tad awkward that the tokens can't block, but I think that's a reasonable enough cost to pay for having this only at 3 mana. I think the biggest hurdle here is that the decks that might want this the most have a better play on turn 3 in Garen. And even without him, I think you've got an issue where some of the best value creatures you can get with Serve Again are things like the Rough Riders, which all land on 3 mana as well. I want to do some experimentation with this to see if I can justify its inclusion in decks, but I could definitely be overestimating this one. Ascend to Power is a huge test of player greed, as its initial promise of eventually getting you something akin to a Necropotence has some sizable hurdles to cover. The Enter's effect is nice for providing some initial momentum on flipping the policy, but 3 mana is hitting the threshold where it starts to become a bit clunky. There are a few ways to maintain consistency with Ascend, and this is another case of a card that can get reliably cast off of a turn 2 pledge into turn 3 Get Your Wish, but I think no new card will be feeling the absence of Keening Bell Tower more than this one. I'm much more optimistic about Research Grant. It's a solid enough bit of card selection, and we've seen strategic planning with Upside do some heavy lifting in the past. While I don't think Research Grant could necessarily live up to Grasp at Frail Dreams' legacy, I do think there's some nice value to be had from transforming into Progress and getting to double up on some spells in the late game, especially for slower reactive decks that can effectively get Progress value twice in a turn cycle. I think in spite of how good a lot of the rare policies are, I'm inclined to believe Security Initiative may outshine most or all of them, thanks purely to the griefing potential. Need your opponent to go slower? At their upkeep, flash in Security Initiative, tap down a land, watch their curve fall apart. Flipping it's a little less reliable, and it's heavily dependent on your opponent's current board state, but if the window ever presents itself, Surveillance State has some crazy combo potential with cards like Digital Lotus, the Kanai Stone, and Altar of Chrome. I made a comment offhandedly about in the Revolution chat about the inevitable adjustment to Security Initiative, but from the sound of things, this may enter Revolution unchanged. If so, thank God Benthelos was nerfed heavily, because folks are about to have their lands iced. Search and Seizure is a reliable hand attack spell, as reliable as it can possibly be in the colors that run it. Being able to choose between stripping away any non-land card or drawing a card can help it keep both flexible value and avoid it just being a dead draw later in the game. It feels a lot like Transgress Identity more than most of the hand attack spells we have right now, and while Agonizing Remorse's Exile is a little more reliable for permanently dealing with the threat, and it's easier to cast, I still think we could definitely see some Search and Seizure play moving forward. And it helps that this plays really nicely with some of the multicolor synergies we've got going on. Tyrell has a lot of recursive elements in the set, owing heavily to the Surveil focus it gives its colors. I've seen a little bit of buzz for Tyrell Ambassador and none for Reconnaissance Agent, so I think it's worth discussing the meaningful comparison points here. Agent has more play on the board, both thanks to coming down for less mana and having the option to exile an opponent's creature. The biggest competition for fighting for the board is Synod of Sanctions from Cyberos. Synod lets the opponent cast the creature as soon as they want, but provides an additional tax, and the Synod's casting cost is less restrictive. The alternate mode is harder to draw a direct comparison. Gravelet Rotation is like the closest thing we've got going on, but it's not entirely clear how much more difficult Agent will be to use for immediate recursion. I think Ambassador's better if you're looking at immediate recursion, but you're less likely to be able to use that card immediately, as Ambassador costs a lot of mana, and the life loss is a real additional penalty, leaving the land cycling being this card's only saving grace. And frankly, I don't think that recursion is so powerful that land cycling this is worthwhile for the synergies beyond just needing the land drop, which makes the Ambassador kind of awkward. If you're really desperate for immediate recursion, maybe give the Tyrell agenda more time than I did. Otherwise, I think Agent's going to serve your needs better. There's a couple multicolor spells I think merit some discussion in this set, both because I think they're reasonably playable on their own, and because the multicolor synergies exist to skew the power of these cards a little bit. Liquidate's likely to be one of our most reliable removal spells for the next 2 years, clearing any creature or planeswalker for only 2 mana. The treasure token and more restrictive casting cost can be real prices to pay sometimes, but I'm comfortable with saying Liquidate will outshine that downside. I'm also a pretty big fan of Traumatic Recollection. If your deck wants to fill the graveyard, Recollection not only helps keep that train rolling, but provides additional creature removal, with the only downside being that you can't really mill unless there's a valuable target to hit. I'm excited to play Liquidate and to see if Recollection can carry its weight. It's official. Deadly Dispute is hitting Revolution. Anyone that played with this card when it was a part of the official standard format knows this card's potential as a really strong draw engine, and there's no lack of valuable cards worth throwing away for 2 cards and a treasure. Plasma Armory provides a lot of fodder to sacrifice. Confetti Cannons is a reasonable creature to throw away that gives you a flyer for your trouble. And Eidolon of Empty Thoughts gives you a second treasure on top of the one from Dispute. With the increased consistency of having Dispute join the format alongside Extraction Ritual, I could see this showing up in a Poisoner Keeper deck list that might be potent enough to rock the format even in Eternal. We'll see how this shakes. If we're looking at creatures worth sacrificing to Deadly Dispute, look no further than Devoted Lackeys. A 2/2 Death Touch is a solid enough creature, and the opportunity to sacrifice this to copy any spell or ability responsible for sacrificing it can really line up right in proper circumstances. There are a few Ulduin cards that sacrifice creatures to flash back, all of which are somewhat promising should you be able to line them up reliably, which is the less consistent part. Heedless Cruelty isn't exactly a stellar spell on its own, but forking it with Lackeys does look like a decent engine to merit consideration. While Lackeys on their own may not really boost up to Xenia by much, I'm curious to know if the presence of Lackeys and minion spam in general could help him see somewhat of a resurgence. I suppose time will tell on that one. I feel like we're a few steps away from making something really cook with Zixthax, Apex, and Writhling, and I'm curious about whether or not Chittering Gargantua is the piece we're missing. Both cards provide great value if you can exile them to the Gargantua, and there's a decent amount of mill support to be had between the Tyrell Pledge, Forgotten Cultivator, and Laystone of Ruin. I'm not certain this deck is coming together quite yet, but with a majority of the cards in this strategy coming from this year, there's time for it to keep coming together over the next couple seasons if it doesn't pan out in the rest of this year. With a bunch of treasure generation comes some more suspect treasure synergy pieces. In order from what I think is best to what I think is worst, sustainable investments could see some genuine play if the plan for treasure decks becomes heavily reliant on jamming high-cost threats turn after turn, though I'm not so sure that's as reliable as staying a bit lower to the ground and leaning on solid outlets for this extra mana. Sola Contraband Playboy is a bit cost restrictive, but turning treasures into food or clues is helpful if you find yourself flooding out on treasures. Not the best payoff for treasure spam when Dante exits, but it may have its merits. Coercive Contractor is a 3-drop that makes treasure, and otherwise, I mean, that activated ability could get funky with Garen or a sack outlet, but that's not exactly stellar. Black Tygal is the biggest miss for me. It really reads like a trap to have to tap your creatures for generating more treasures. If you're going for minion spam, maybe this is good. But then, why are you pledging Hazak if you want treasure tokens? Assault Engine is another card that just looks maybe a little too clunky, but I think if you can get this card into play, it may actually be really solid. That Enters effect can be repeated if you flicker it, mostly with Experimental Flight, but I mean, if you really want to push yourself, Vinette's Freestyle and Eternal Echoes could hypothetically get the job done. The angle I think is a little more enticing here is using this as a piece to play into Sinister Sampler. Dig in the early game and find a way to pitch the engine, then sample and threaten to make a fresh engine every turn afterwards. Is this a good plan? Not really, but it's an interesting thought experiment at least. Adaptive Hydra is interesting, but has a major hurdle in the way called Tenacious Snapvines. Hydra has more immediacy thanks to its access to haste, and will probably end up with a higher toughness count without much issue. The problem really lies in how resilient Snapvines can get and how many keywords it can pile on. Ward 2, Lifelink, Trample, and Death Touch all hit hard, which the Hydra has no access to, and hit even harder when the Snapvines can consistently survive combat without much trouble. That all being said, Snapvines does rotate on New Year's Day, so maybe the Hydra just needs a new year to have a better shot. 3 different 4-power creatures for 2 mana entering this format is crazy. Where's Ferocious Flame when you need it? At face value, each of these has their uses, and each has their obvious drawbacks. If your deck can reliably and repeatedly target Sleeper Insurgent, it starts to look like a viable aggressive creature, but only one of the 2 targeted cliques can actually get the job done, as Silliman only targets untapped creatures. Dormant Monstrosity is slow to get going, but the draw engine seems interesting to play with, and the 3 disposable counters are easy fodder for Axiomatic Shift. And Expendable Arsonist is the most straightforward. Maybe you're cheating this enough of Penwrath Dispatcher, but realistically, you're probably just running this out as a 2-mana deal 4 in a burnt deck. Each of these cards has their place, I just can't really say whether or not those places want them, or even if those places exist yet in some cases. There are still a few more +1/+1 counter synergy cards that we have to talk about. Overbearing Researcher is the better of these 2 in my eyes, as building up a high ward cost across your board can really help your potentially grindier beatdown deck dodge meaningful interaction out of your opponents. Silliman Regrafter has some merit, sliding singular counters across your board to make said meaningful interaction feel less meaningful over time. Neither of these cards are so stellar as to be the key to making a counters deck work, but I could see either or both meriting some testing at the very least. It's time to talk about the bug. Scourge of Capitalism may be one of our best reanimation targets going into the new format, which will probably excite some of you and make the rest either dread what's coming or just miss Tyrant of Tributes. The real reason to discuss this in the first place comes with an uncommon that's drawn a decent bit of attention from the community. Extraction Mission represents the potential to double up your reanimation target for 16 damage up front off of the Scourge, reduced by the toughness of your opponent's 2 most powerful creatures, and then immediately provide an 8/8 trampler swinging in. If you can pay blue to flash in the extraction mission on your opponent's turn, that becomes 16 damage immediately off of the enters effect, and attacking for 16 the following turn. There are certainly metrics to combat this interaction, just don't have creatures in play as the obvious bet, so is having graveyard hate, but I think this is consistent enough that it could make waves, though I know there are concerns that extraction mission could get reworked. We'll see what the release notes hold soon enough. Cabinet Recruiter seems kind of unreliable if I'm honest, but there is one world where I could see it becoming a solid include. Gaze Upon Civilization plus Moresso is an engine I'm genuinely curious to see if it has any merit, and in a deck that's as heavily reliant on that 4-drop elemental, a way to search it up does just seem nice. That all being said, I think Cabinet Recruiter might just be going a little too deep. I'll be honest, I really wasn't expecting a Heat Shimmer. I wasn't expecting it in a format with Lacebark Wielder, just desperately looking for the right instance to pop off with. I don't know if patent pending is a key to making Lacebark decks work perfectly, necessarily, but I do think this is a crucial piece to get Wielder there eventually. Copying your Wielder gets the mana back that you spent on the patent pending immediately, which opens up the avenue for future patent pendings, and the fact that your Wielders can freely give themselves trample and haste does start to escalate fast. I wanted to make Wielder work last rotation, but didn't stick around with the format enough to give it a try. Maybe this is the opportunity. Remember those 4-power 2-drops? Well, what if I said there was a way to turn those 4-drops into delayed card advantage? Mareyes promises a solid amount of impulse draw for the low cost of sacrificing a creature. The bigger the body, the more cards you see. Having access to them for a whole additional turn helps Mareyes feel more reliable, which is especially nice if the trade you're lining up is 3 mana and 2 cards for a chance to play 4. I'm sure there are worlds where this could look much sillier, such as sacrificing a creature that received the full attention from your pledge to Penwrath, or maybe sacrificing a Scourge to Capitalism that you're about to sacrifice. But I'm curious to see if just running a few decent 2-drops is all it takes to keep the engine oiled. The only question now is, what's the card that even wants this engine in the first place? This is your disclaimer now. Not every card I'm talking about here is necessarily good. Shocker after talking about chaff commons early in the review, I know, but just because a card gets brought up here doesn't mean I think it's a card you should have to have on your mind. I do think Warrant Borcop has a small chance to see play in a greedy, grindy black deck that tries to continuously cycle creatures and shred the opponent's hand, using Garen to loop creatures and maybe topping off at Innerring's Pupil to truly grind away what few pieces your opponent has left. If I'm right, that deck seems brutal to play against. If I'm right, Warrant Borcop's role in that deck may be largely filler. We'll see what it takes to make this have more than just a passing merit, I guess. Also on the list of cards that might not even warrant discussion, Merciless Headsman grabbed my eye initially for its prospect of yielding 2 bodies on a single card. If I think Hazuka Agenda and Election Fraud are good for spamming a pair of minions, maybe there's use in one of those 2 bodies actually doing something meaningful. A decent sacrifice outlet's always appreciated in Rev, and honestly, this looks to be one of the better sack outlets moving forward, at least until we get a free sack outlet back again. Aristocrats hasn't exactly had the pieces to feel like a viable archetype for a couple of rotations now, though, so maybe Headsman just has to wait a bit longer. But hey, the Venerable Veteran reads 2 black, draw a card, so maybe that's worth noting, I guess. I'm not 100% certain here, but I have a funny feeling Corporate Espionage might have been inspired in some capacity by Organized Espionage from Viridian's last mission. Or it's just a really cool coincidence. The Surveil 1 fail state is useful for Corporate, since it can give you some value even if you aren't looking to cash in, and the card draw not costing life is nice too. That all being said, yeah, Organized Espionage was still so much more potent at its job. Stripping your opponent of cards was a worthy cause to pay life into, and the Anthem stacked well with many of the powerful, cheap black threats of its era. Maybe if we had pre-nerf Undercroft Poisoner, Corporate would be just as viable as Organized was, but until the Curator team decides they want to revert a card that still kind of causes trouble here and there, just a few months before its rotation, I wouldn't hold my breath for this one. In such a complex set running around with so many explosive engines, you'd be surprised to learn there are only 2 pieces of on-the-stack interaction to play with in Nylin. Veto does look like a somewhat decent impression of Spell Pierce, but it also looks like it's kind of locked into being used as anti-interaction for greedier decks, relying on approval value from Gaze Upon Civilization, Moreso, and the like. Gridlock comparatively has some nice flexibility, but just pales in comparison to Afara's Judgment and the other hard counters we've got in the format right now. Maybe if the next few rotations struggle to bring solid stack interaction, it could have a shot, but that might be a grim fate for hard control players to even consider. There's also a few pieces for our resident mono blue tempo fans. Sleeper Strix is a pretty promising creature even without its last line of text. 1 mana 1/2 flash flyers, plenty good, tapping a creature is even better. I'm not sure how often that Surveil trigger will come up, but Lantern Light Assailant does provide a decently reliable way of doing so, and Abscond has some added utility when protecting your copies of Strix from a board wipe while bouncing an artifact or creature, or even just a recently made tapped treasure. Stasis Chamber has some promise too. It's our only 1 mana way to freeze a creature in this new format, and while the Vigilance Clause isn't likely to matter, it still seems like a decent option for keeping troublesome blockers out of the way. It might not be enough for Blue Tempo to rise again on its own, though, so we'll see if people even give it a shot. Selective Truthseeker seems like a genuinely strong card that I expect to see a decent amount moving forward. Whitecliff Pilgrim's a decent card out of Uldun that just didn't quite have the support it needed to thrive, and Truthseeker might finally be the push it needed to take off. This may take a bit of fiddling with to make it work perfectly, but Ozon's Blessing seems like it'd help this duo meet up consistently, and maybe pledging to Hazak can provide the consistent flow of creatures to keep this engine rolling smoothly. Getaway Proxy and Social Engineering both seem tailor-made for whatever this whole Portal Knights deck I've heard about is doing. Continuously reusing the enter and leave effects of Rough Riders seems fairly strong on its own, and these cards provide more consistency to help you keep doing so. Social Engineering has a bit more promise in my eyes. The worst case scenario of making a 1/1 token and bouncing an opposing creature is nice, but making token copies of your own creatures while picking them up to hand kind of just feels like cheating when you're getting 2 Rough Rider triggers out of the exchange, while just keeping the Rough Rider in play. Proxy is a bit more awkward since Malfunctioning Portal can occasionally flip into it and strand a Rough Rider in exile, but the improved consistency of being able to abuse Rough Rider triggers without necessarily finding the portal seems enticing enough to give it a try. I'm really curious to see if these 1 mana expendable creatures have any use in the new format we're headed into. They're reliable cards to send to your graveyard through self-mill, and there are some appealing synergies with the Leaves the Graveyard package from Uldun or the previously mentioned Chittering Gargantua. These seem more reliable for Gargantua than merely having cards in the graveyard, since sacrificing them while they're in play opens the door to use them a second time for Gargantua. But I can't be too confident that Gargantua is going to come together like I want it to. I'll definitely be trying it, though. Speaking of disposable minions, the first battalion helps you pay off for not disposing of them? I'll be honest here, I'm not really sure this one gets there. The minion tokens are just renewable enough that I'm not keen on spending 5 mana for the chance to swing with decayed tokens more than once. Maybe there's something more to be gained from using it in conjunction with a few actual minion creatures we're getting, but don't quote me on that one. A 2 mana 1/2 mana dork is pretty fragile, but the potential for multiple uses a turn can't be ignored. I know there are still some folks out there desperately waiting for Orbinoid to have its day, but maybe Mana Harvesters is its more restrained, realistic cousin that actually has a shot at yielding some value. Casting Alihana into a gubernatorial fundraiser on turn 3 may just be a solid enough play pattern to be worth giving a shot. Look, Ruinous Discovery and Change Allegiances aren't exactly all that great. 2 mana sorcery speed, artifact, and enchantment removals, not what you want to be doing in Revolution, and the small upsides of each don't really justify their space in your deck. The only reason I'm bringing these up at all is because it's worth remembering. We're going into a new format with new cards built around enchantment tokens, and if you're going to be seeing those, you're probably also going to be seeing a lot of treasures and other artifact tokens along with it. The more your targeted removal can favorably interact with enchantment tokens, the better. If you're looking to use the new cards to play into this removal, have a plan for when, not if, your opponent disrupts your clique. Do not get caught unaware in either case. I've seen far more talk about Tormented Soul than I was expecting on my initial pass through the set, but after some consideration, I've got to say, my memory is apparently really bad. Back at Cyberos's rotation into the format, I messed around a bit with Rooftop Slink early on and was really impressed with how reliable the little guy could be. Any cards that needed to be in the graveyard could get sent there without too much trouble, the Cybersoul cost wasn't that difficult, and the flip side was pretty effective at causing my opponents trouble. Now, Ignited Soul doesn't really play the same role, but it does have one magic word that helps it get in even more consistently than an early Slink. Menace makes so much of a difference here. It's really hard for early creatures to be consistently put into play to block the soul, and having to put 2 creatures in play to block a 1/1 just feels kind of bad. I think this is good enough that I wouldn't be shocked to find Reanimator decks banking the early game in part on Ignited Soul, perhaps alongside Demographer. Maybe the fire really is there for this one. Gravelit Meditation leaving the format does open the window for a new Edict to fill the void. There are still enough ways for the opponent to sacrifice on their own, between Unstable Concoction, Iris Pledge, and Omen of Slaughter, but Rank and Defile opens up the window to get a little more value like Gravelit did. Rather than sacrificing to rebuy a creature, Rank and Defile has the freedom to be recast as long as the turn you're doing so, saw a creature or token go to your bin. I think that's likely to happen reliably enough for mid-range decks to give this a try, so long as they aren't locked in onto leaning into multicolor synergies. But control decks may need to lean on Iris Pledge for their Edict needs, unless they don't even really want to bother spending less than 4 mana for their Edict. Hired Shot may be very dependent on how reliable treasure generation turns out to be, but there is one small boon going for it, as Cybros did have a few artifacts capable of generating mana. And hey, I get to talk about a Worlds card that isn't Get Your Wish, and if the power differential between them didn't make it apparent, it also obviously wasn't designed by a Worlds winner. Clockwork Harvester has needed a bit of a push to really help it kick off, as where it lands currently is just a tad too clunky for it to really do what it needs to. Between the abundant Surveil, the cheap artifact source matters effects like Hired Shot, this could help my poor sweet boy actually get into a deck with a respectable league run. Oh, and Layshard casts this for 1 as well. That's probably more important. I was fully ready to write off Pinnacle of Progress as a trap, which is kind of hypocritical of me considering all of the Gargantua praise I was singing earlier. But then it hit me. This says permanents, not creatures. Loyalty counters, charge counters, living counters, page counters, it all works for Pinnacle to come down faster. This is a good thing to play like turn 3 pretty reliably as a 2-drop while also still developing something else. I'm so glad Unstable Formation got nerfed away from 0 mana, because Pinnacle really does have the potential to hit fast enough that Ward 2 may just as well be hexproof. I think this might be a more genuine boon to counters decks than all of the +1/+1 counter creatures this set has to offer, which is kind of a frightening thought. So originally I was going to talk about Pinnacle alongside Covert Infiltrator to make an emphasis on how you should keep an eye out for deck building traps. But then everything I just talked about hit me, so now I'm not so sure I can really talk this card down. Maybe this is the next villainy. Nah, that's an overcorrection, and I think some of the delirium of writing the script at 1:30 in the morning is starting to kick in. Covert Infiltrator is an interesting card to think about, turning self-mill into virtual card advantage, but this is the pretty notable cost to doing so. The only world where I'm really happy to spend 2 life to pick this up is one where I've got an ample supply of looting and rummaging to make it worthwhile. Garen's decent, Demographer's decent, but we may need a bit more than that, and even then, that might not be enough for the Infiltrator to work. Finally, let's talk lands. Bloodlike Rivers is leaving a pretty massive void behind in this respect, and I'm not entirely sure Nylin's equipped to fill the role being left behind here. Dormant lands were critical for aggressive decks to make more pip-intensive cards consistently castable, while providing greedier decks and those aggressive builds a way to cash in those excess lands for cards. The new Pledge lands are not that. I think Pledge lands are exciting, but they have some tough competition with the Theros creature lands being a more immediate return on mana investment. That being said, I do think some grindier control builds will be happy to run a copy or 2 to Pledge Tyrael if needed, though that's kind of a late game plan. Speaking of voids left behind by Bloodlike Rivers, New Divides helped mana bases across the format feel more stable for the past 2 years, and it'll probably take a lot of time for people to fully figure out how to balance out their greed in the coming weeks. Redeveloped Cityscape has its own ability to sort of balance greed a bit. It's a phenomenal card in the mulligan, allowing you to transform a 1-lander into 2 lands with a shot to actually play the game, or take a hand with lands of the wrong color and turn them into actually being able to make things happen. The only problem with Cityscape is that it becomes so much worse the later the game goes on, as that exile clause quickly becomes more and more detrimental. Still, fixing for 2 colors on 1 land, what could go wrong? And hey, maybe you're going deep on Cosmic Colossus and suddenly that exile goes from a cost to an enabler, and if you really, really want to dig deep. Finally, let's talk about the districts. If you can reliably get the land types needed, these are great. Untapped, as long as you're on like turn 4 onwards, maybe. And I think they get better in Eternal with the few type to tools we have kicking around there. That all being said, I'm not optimistic about having access to these when Hyperpop's also in the format. Hyperpop's lands, tapped for the same colors, are always entering tapped, but can also be discarded later on as one-shot pump spells. I suppose we'll see which cycle works best through playtesting, but even if Hyperpop's lands outshine them for now, Hyperpop does rotate in 8 months, so if they don't have a shot now, the districts will still have their day eventually. And that wraps up our inauguration for Cliques of Nylin. After Nylin finishes shaking up the format in the launch week, I'm excited to see how the dust settles, which cliques land at the top of the ladder, and what strategies reign supreme. Like I mentioned at the top, if what you've seen here has your interest piqued, please check out the Custom Magic Discord in the description below if you haven't already gotten there, to give the format a try for yourself, and maybe stomp my janky League decks for a fun afternoon activity. And be sure to give some love to Stasis and the Revolution Curators for another upcoming season of the format. I really can't wait to try all this out, and I'll see you in the Revolution chat. Thanks for watching.